Welcome to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I'm your host, Dori Pham. Join me and my fellow public policy classmates as we explore potential policy solutions for today's most pressing societal challenges. Welcome back to Policy Chats. Today I'm joined with a very special guest, Mark Takano, who represents California 39th Congressional District, which includes much of Riverside. Congressman Takano grew up in Riverside and has spent his career serving the very community that helped shape him. Before entering Congress, he spent more than 2 decades as a public school teacher, an experience that continues to influence how he approaches leadership, policymaking, and communication. In Congress, Congressman Takano has become a leading voice on issues ranging from education and workforce development to veterans' health and accountability in government. Um, he serves on the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, and previously chaired the House Veterans Affairs Committee. And so, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. To start off, let's dive a bit back to your background. So before entering Congress, you spent over 2 decades of being a teacher, teaching literature. How did being an educator influence the way you communicate, listen, and lead as a policymaker?
Well, well, first of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to be with both of you, Urban and Dory. I was a public school teacher for 24 years. I think maybe the way to answer this question is to understand why I became a public school teacher. I grew up in this community. I grew up in Riverside, in the La Sierra part of the city, and that wasn't the wealthiest part of the city. Um, I grew up in a middle class, lower middle class home. I don't think we were ever kind of considered low income. Both my parents eventually were working. Um, I was a good student. I earned a scholarship to Harvard College, and I originally intended to go into the legal profession, become a lawyer. And from a very young age, I had always thought about a career in politics, and it was motivated by, in part, exposure to the impeachment proceedings of the House Judiciary Committee that I watched on public television as an 11 or a 12-year-old, and was very much influenced by watching Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, who was an African-American representative from the city of Houston. And I think it might have been actually her first term in Congress. She was a freshman member of Congress, and she made a very big impression on me. And then she talked about how unlikely it was for someone like her to be in the place that she was, to be what she called an inquisitor. She says, I am an inquisitor. I'm sitting in judgment of the person who occupies the highest office in the country. And, just to think about her being a Black woman, being in that place, and, meaning that the Constitution originally didn't contemplate that someone like her would actually become an inquisitor of the President of the United States, holding him accountable to the law. I was very much inspired by her eloquence, and I decided that I wanted to go into politics. And part of my plan was to go to a very good university. And but how did I become a teacher? Well, upon graduating from Harvard, I felt a little burnt out. I mean, having traveled a distance from Riverside, California, from kind of a middle class, lower class background. I wasn't from an especially wealthy family. Um, I didn't have a postgraduate plan laid out for me, uh, and except for wanting to go to law school, I needed to make money to pay my rent. So I ended up teaching in the public schools in the Boston area, in the sub, and I noticed the big difference in school districts. Um, just the distance it took from riding the Green Line all the way to Brookline, which had very good schools and some of the best teachers with advanced degrees, often doctorates. And then going into the inner city of Boston, that was a school system that was run by the city of Boston, or there were different schools. The Brookline schools were different from the Boston schools. And uh, I remember having to walk through a metal detector for security in the inner city of Boston. Of course, Boston, the history of Boston schools, they went through a lot of strife over desegregation and integrating their schools racially. Uh, I, I was after finishing college, I was casting about for what my purpose would be to go into politics. Why would I go into politics? And the I believe that a lot of the social economic challenges of our country were rooted in the unequal educational opportunities. That some students had access to really great schooling and others did not. It's still an issue with us today, and there's still big debates about that. Um, and I thought to myself, I need to learn how I am going to. Uh, I need to learn what are the barriers to making educational opportunity available to more people in our country, because I felt that was like a big part of the larger systemic challenge to uh, resolving a lot of the social conflicts that we have in our country. If more people had opportunity that comes from a good education, we could become a more perfect union, more equality. So I think that kind of gives you a sense of the values that I wanted to bring. And being a teacher, no, look, I thought it was only going to be a short-term stint, and I would go to law school, uh, teach 1 or 2 years, and learn everything I needed to know about teaching in the public schools. Uh, but I learned that uh, teaching is an awfully demanding and challenging career. Uh, that it takes just a lot of teachers don't end up teaching after they've been in the profession for 2 or 3 years, and if you make it to 5 years, um, that's very fortunate. Um, but I learned that teaching, it was a very humbling experience to learn that uh, to manage a classroom, to design a curriculum, to prepare. These were all very much more demanding than I ever could have imagined. And so I kind of did I learn how to solve America's educational challenges? Um, I would say that would be a big overstatement. I would say that I learned a lot that didn't work. I learned a lot about the different kinds of experiments that, for instance, test-driven accountability, the emphasis on high-stakes testing and as a way to kind of hold teachers and schools and administrators accountable was a very ill-conceived idea when it was sort of the big idea of the early aughts. And when I actually got to Congress, uh, the Obama administration was carrying over ideas from the Bush administration about this high stakes accountability and testing. And I was among the Democrats that disagreed with President Obama's Secretary of Education that the high stakes testing wasn't working. So anyway, that so I went to Congress to increase opportunities for better education, better job training, better workforce opportunities. Um, and uh, I think I carried like a 24-year experience being a teacher, but also a community college trustee. I put that in my introduction. I was elected trustee of the Riverside Community College District, and I learned uh, a lot about higher education, about workforce development, economic development through my service on the community college board. So I was doing these two things at the same time. By day I was teaching mostly high school, and uh, several evenings in a month I was also attending meetings as a trustee of the community college district.
Wow, that is such a empowering story. You know, I completely agree with you that education is the root of building a strong economy and a strong workforce, and so it's really impactful to train young and talented workers and shaping their like uh, uh, shaping the passion into the right and correct field. So as a follow up, um, you on in Congress, you also are a big advocate for veterans and especially veterans welfare. Can you tell me a bit more on like why 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 veterans?
Well, there's a lot of, I think, compelling answers to that. Um, so let's start with my teaching experience. I mean, uh, a lot of my students, I mean, I didn't teach the most advanced and most successful students. I taught um, students that were, by the time they got to high school, were behind in their reading. So I was kind of doing literacy work. I also taught literature. Um, but, I noticed, you know, right after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, the aggressive way in which for-profit colleges were targeting families and the people who live in the Inland Empire, including low-income families, low-income students. And when I'm talking about for-profit colleges, I'm not talking about UCR, which is a public university. I'm talking about the University of Redlands or Cal Baptist, which are private institutions. I'm talking about um, profit-driven uh, institutions that call themselves colleges, and often students they're not subjected to really any standards or admission standards. Uh, these institutions are really great about taking their benefits, well, their student loans, their Pell Grants, and really not providing them with education that they can get a good job with. Um, you know, I hesitate to actually mention names of these institutions, but they do put a lot of money into marketing. Now, these institutions also target veterans, uh, and at the time, uh, these institutions. So we have a law called the oh gosh, what was that called? Uh, it was not called the 10% rule, but it was. But what the law actually said is that at least 10% of your revenue had to come from non-federal sources. And that rule was intended to like say if your education is worth something, then it must mean that at least 10% of the money that comes from actual paying students. Uh, so you can see that UCR's revenue, a bunch of it comes from the state, right? A bunch of it comes from students who are actually paying for that. Um, most of the money that comes to UCR is not coming from the federal government. Um, so the idea was that you can't depend on people who are using student loans who are backed by the federal government or Pell Grants to come, and that's all. You're just depending on students who use these sources of money. Well, that's what these for-profit colleges are really good at doing, about attracting students that have Pell Grants or the GI Bill. The GI Bill is even a more generous source of um, student funding, right? And GI Bill is more like a grant. It's like you fulfill the requirements by serving in the military. In exchange, you get education. That's why a lot of young people, especially from our region, will join the military. Part of it is, aside from the patriotism of serving the country, it's also a way for them to get an education. Well, it turns out these for-profit colleges were uh, targeting veterans specifically because uh, the GI Bill uh, did not count um, uh, against the 90% of the money that would come in as federal money. It meant that uh, a veteran, for example, on the GI Bill, the GI Bill revenue didn't count as federal money. Now I don't know if I'm trying to. It's been a while since I explained this to people, but what that meant is that it meant that for-profit colleges wanted to get as many veterans as possible. Why? Because they could take veterans' money, which is actually federal money, but it didn't count. It counted as the 10%. So it showed up as like you had to show at least 10% of your money wasn't from federal sources. But believe it or not, that GI Bill money that was actually federal money didn't count as the 90%. It counted toward the 10. And what did it mean? So if you have a lot of money that what should have been like private money, individual money, non-federal money, you could recruit a lot more students. You follow me here?
Yeah.
A lot more money. So I thought this is a huge ripoff because these schools were delivering very poor education. They basically were taking this military service benefit, not giving our veterans very good education, and then it allowed these for-profit colleges to recruit even more students who were not veterans, who were like low-income kids, single moms, people who wanted to get a different job right after this terrible downturn in the economy. And I would drive around the Inland Empire and see these huge billboards for these for-profit colleges, and it would make me really angry because who was able to afford paying the 10, 15, $20,000 a month to put those billboards up? The for-profit colleges that were making a huge amount of money. So anyway, that became one of the big reasons why. It became another thing that I did in my early years of Congress, was to fix this problem, because I hated seeing that veterans were specifically being targeted to be ripped off by these for-profit colleges. Also, I sought out the veterans committee because we have March Air Reserve Base. We used to have the Norton Air Force Base. Even though it's no longer an active duty military base, we still have a huge number of veterans living in Riverside County. We have a huge number of our young people that go into the service, right? And so I felt this was, really a match for my district, my committee assignment, and then the third thing, I feel a huge debt of gratitude, and one reason I think I'm a member of Congress today um, is because of my own family history. I had great uncles who served in the 442nd Infantry Battalion, which is a segregated all Japanese American fighting unit during World War II. And even as my parents were little kids, they were incarcerated in Japanese American internment camps, incarceration camps. Being accused of being enemy aliens of our country. Never any evidence or proof of that. But you know, Japanese Americans during World War II were definitely um, villainized for no good reason. But at the same time, we had Nisei soldiers who were volunteers and fought mostly in Europe. Some of them fought in the Pacific as military intelligence, in the military intelligence service. But a big chunk of them, most of them, were fighting in the European theater. And one of those uncles died, in his age 23. Um, he died just a month or two short of VE Day. And I think of myself as very much in debt to uh, the part of my family that stepped up, fought for the country, even though the country was not living up to its, uh, let's say, the promise of our Constitution. Um, that they were being discriminated against, they were being imprisoned for no good reason, but yet they still believed and fought for the United States of America. Um, and I think the example they set, somehow created the space for me a generation or two later to become a member of the United States Congress. And so, serving veterans today is a part of recognizing that sense of gratitude that I have for the service that they rendered to our country.
Just want to say thank you for looking out for veterans, especially those pursuing higher education. I know a lot of my friends after high school went out to do the same thing. So knowing that someone is looking out for them is, heartwarming.
Yeah.
I just want to ask, as a member of the Education and Workforce Committee, what reforms do you believe are necessary to make it so that not only veterans but all students have equal opportunity in today's job market?
Well, I think we can do a lot more to make sure that all students, as many students as possible, are college ready, that they don't have to do expensive and, uh, how do I say, it's expensive, but also put on a lot of time. They have to put a lot more time into remedial courses, right? They arrive at college and find out that they don't have the writing skills or the reading skills or the math that they need to have, and so they have to go through remediation um, and do catch up, and they don't get any credit for that, right? There's no credit, and so it's expensive. It's expensive for the student. The student, a lot of students may give up, um, uh, and I think for when I learned as a community college trustee, uh, we the community colleges were very successful in preparing the transfer students to the UC system or transfer students to the Cal State system uh, or to the private universities. That they were very very good at that, but we still had a lot of students that didn't persist. They if they find out that they have to do a half year of a writing class that won't count for credit, that can get very discouraging, especially if you're under financial pressures, right? So it's very important for the schools to be able to graduate students that are college ready, um, have minimal need for remediation. Now, what can we do about that? I've always thought that concurrent enrollment, early college or middle colleges. Uh, Another way to say this is like high school students that can graduate with college credit already, that they already have their English 1A class taken care of senior year, like they're done with it, uh, and that way whatever classes they take in college, they don't have to take any remedial classes. Math is the other big thing. So like college level math, getting those things done by the senior year. Even better than that, maybe you get a whole year's worth of college credit done in your senior year. In some places, you can get at least 2 years. Some places, like if you're going to a middle college, you can make the choice to actually, or what's called a, not the middle college, but middle college. There's early college and middle college. So there are early college programs that work in conjunction with community colleges. There are some programs that are called early colleges that are just from the time you're a freshman, you know that you're going to go through a program that you'll start taking college level work at when you're a junior. And everybody in that school will tend to graduate with 2 years of college being under the belt. I think we don't challenge teenagers enough in our country. To make all this work, we have to kind of make sure that students are able to enter into the 9th grade, with better reading levels. So we also, in order to make all this work, we need to make sure that we have teachers at the secondary level that are qualified to teach college level work, who can maybe do both. But we need to essentially have more teachers at the secondary level that can basically be community college teachers, have a master's degree in their subject area. So we need to improve the quality of the teachers. And I think we can do a lot more, in another area, which is how do we prepare elementary school teachers to really, I think there's been a lot of knowledge gained over the last 20 years about how best to do literacy. There was an experiment in whole language that didn't turn out to whole language philosophy, and training teachers in the specifics of phonemic awareness, how to teach students the correspondence between, the letters on a page and the specific phonemes or sounds that each letter makes. So, but it's the phonetic philosophy. So, and then in addition to that, that basic early, so I have a lot of respect for elementary school teachers, the meticulousness, the organization it takes to be effective at teaching a student how to read so that by 4th grade, they're reading to learn. We also, I think, need more teachers at the elementary level who grasp and have an ability to deliver a curriculum in math and science that we need, but it has to be age appropriate. We need those teachers that can pique an interest in science, for example, that's hands-on. And I see a lot of that starting to happen in the schools around here in Riverside. So anyway, I can go on and on. I mean, it's like, I know we have a lot to talk about. So I think, so if I were to recap, we need to improve, the quality of our teachers, their ability to teach, college level curriculum at the high school level. We need to equip our teachers at the elementary school level to lay the foundations in math and in science. And we need to be able to challenge our adolescents, I think, much more rigorously. And all with the aim of having a greater percentage of students college ready by the time they're leaving high school and then entering into college.
Yeah. On the topic of college readiness, I know a lot of students, especially in the English department, struggle to meet the requirements because of they grow up in a multilingual household, or they just their parents only will speak a different language than English.
Yes.
I was wondering, is there anything specific for that we could kind of
actually, yes. I taught in a school that was predominantly Latino, but there were also students that came from, Asian households where English was not the first language. Um, and you know, I came from a household where my father was going through college. My mother didn't really. She was a very smart lady, but she basically had a high school education. Um, there's a difference growing up in a household like mine and a household where, say, both the mother and father are like advanced degrees. They are professors, or one's a doctor and another. I mean, just the level of language that you're going to hear in the household is going to be a more, let's say, elevated English, right? So I didn't grow up speaking a second language as my primary. I mean, I spoke English as a primary language, but even I'm just trying to show you the difference. But compare that to someone who's growing up in a household where Spanish is the predominant English, right? So their vocabulary is going to be different. Um, there, you may not be sort of in a household where um, books are read, but the daily language experience of yours is going to be much more circumscribed. It doesn't mean that people aren't smart, that they don't have the capacity. So, I noticed as a ninth grade teacher uh, that I had a lot of students that I was failing. But it didn't make any sense to me. It wasn't that these students were uh, less smart. It was they came to me with, well, I'll give you an example. I would one of the required texts that I had to teach was, according to the test-driven accountability, we couldn't use a different text, was Great Expectations. Well, Great Expectations, written by Charles Dickens, I remember one of the students saying Pip's name is Peep, right? Um, and there's different dialects within Charles Dickens that students from second language households had to contend with. I'm just saying it wasn't the ideal text to use to teach the things I needed to teach. Now, one of the things I did when I left teaching, and this is many years ago, and there could have been much more advances between the 14 years that have passed and now, the Cal State University at San Bernardino was experimenting with much shorter texts, nonfiction, not using Charles Dickens as the base text. It's shorter. That means that students don't have to labor over complicated dialects, and they learn how to write papers that that are about arguments. You kind of look at, say, an opinion piece that's maybe 3 or 4 pages long. It's a shorter piece of reading. It's still demanding intellectually, but you have to kind of learn how to analyze it and do the kind of writing that you're going to do in college. Now, if I could begin that approach not senior year, which is when we started to teach kids to do this, but start to do it much earlier in the curriculum. But I mean, there had to be much more thought given to what are the kinds of readings that are appropriate for teaching second language students. Having training in literacy, so you recognize which students. Most for many students, reading doesn't come naturally. So, but not every teacher is trained to be able to recognize who those students are, right? So, I still think we're not training teachers enough to be able to recognize dyslexia, for example. And dyslexia can range from being like very intense to like very subtle. So these are all things that I think we can improve on. But second language students, I definitely think there's much more that we could be doing to train teachers. And this is another aspect of elevating the level of skill in the teachers, And I believe the federal government can play a role in making those grants available. But we have a kind of administration which is very anti, quote unquote, DEI. And this kind of money, I think, this is the sort of thing that I can imagine this administration would be opposed and would be interfering in making sure that schools have the ability to do this. But we need to definitely empower schools to do the kinds of things I just described.
Social injustice, health disparities, and climate change. Are you interested in pressing challenges like these facing our region and world? Make your impact by joining the next cohort of the UCR Master of Public Policy program. Learn more at mpp.ucr.edu.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. I completely agree. As a international student coming from Vietnam,
Yeah.
English was not my first language, and so learning English was a big.
Did you have to
different.
take the TOEFL exam to get here, or did you go to schools here in America before you got to the university?
So this is my second year here in the U.S. I studied high school in Vietnam, and so I did the IB program. I don't know if you're familiar.
Yeah,
with
I'm
it.
familiar with it.
Yeah,
so you did the IB program in Vietnam.
Yes. And that it really helped me. Coming like getting to the IB program, and completely agree with you. Education needs to be changed systemically, not from like a certain area, but like all across, starting from like elementary to like high school, needs to be reformed. So thank you so much for your answer and highlighting the issues and problems we have like today.
Sure.
So to shift gears a little bit,
I know we got stuck into education, right? But it's lots to talk about. Yeah.
Completely agree. So to shift gears a bit, one of your most notable bills was the Honoring Our PACT Act.
Yes.
And I just out of curiosity, why did it take so long for veterans' toxic exposure to be formally recognized?
Well, I'll get straight to the point. I think cost was a big consideration. The numbers of people we're talking about that were exposed to toxic burn pits, that was the biggest, I think, motivation for this legislation, were our military service members who were exposed to these huge football-sized pits that were bulldozed open, and then you think about a military base that might have tens of thousands of service members living there. They basically built a small little town, a medium-sized town actually, and waste disposal, whether it was human waste, whether it was old computers, whether it was whatever, would just be taken to these huge pits, and the material would be doused with aviation fuel, lit on fire, and the inhabitants, our service members of the bases, would be exposed to this, sometimes 24/7. So, part of, I think, the late recognition was recognizing that there were consequences to this exposure. Part of what helped us understand this was the impact on first responders who weren't necessarily veterans to 9/11. So when the trade towers fell, you remember how you may not remember, you may be too young to remember this, but the trade towers collapsed in fire and smoke, but they smoldered and burned for a long time, and all manner of material were subject to those burns, and the first responders who had to rescue people or who were around this, who inhaled all that smoke, they began to suffer some effects, and so there were efforts to take care of them. But I think that in a way paved the way for us to look at the exposures that our service members experienced when they were in Afghanistan or in Iraq, and burn pits were used in previous experiences. So we had to sort of get to a place where there was enough organization among veterans of the post 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan experience. The numbers of them began to organize and say, look, we're starting to experience respiratory illnesses, cancers, and we think it's due to the fact that we were exposed to all of this, all of the smoke from these burn pits. So, we think that took place in 2002. It takes a few years for people to understand that these exposures were somehow linked. Now, science, to actually kind of establish that a cancer that a service member got was caused by all of this, there's that sort of scientific evidence takes a lot of time. But we definitely knew that there were untimely cancers starting to show up. But the scientific proof was that takes time to do. So you look at between say 2004, 2005, fast forward to like 10 years later, I'm elected to Congress in 2012, 2013. That's a 10 to 15 year span. Members of the House of Representatives from both parties were beginning to hear from constituents who were service members. And it was really a grassroots effort because, the Veterans Administration, the bureaucrats and the VA, to respond to the magnitude of the numbers of service members that were exposed to burn pits was pretty huge, and to kind of establish who's eligible to get medical and disability pensions for what happened. The costs we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. By the time I became the chairman of the committee in 2019, I led a congressional delegation in 2019 to Afghanistan. I met with the commander there, who took me aside and said, so I was in Kabul, and I remember just how smoky Kabul was. Not even burn pits, but like in the wintertime in Kabul, it's like Riverside, which is in a basin here, surrounded by mountains, but it's at a much higher elevation. So it's a basin. It's really cold there in the winter, and they're burning everything. They don't have the Air Quality Management District here, which is restricting what kind of automobiles and catalytic converters, and it is, you can just feel the grit that's in the air. That's not even what I'm talking about burn pits. That's just like people having to be in Kabul. But the commander there in Kabul told me, he says, Congressman, you should do something about these burn pits. Do something about toxic exposure. And in 2019, when Speaker Pelosi and I met with veterans groups, must have had like 20 or 30 veterans groups, we asked them what their priority was. And they all, by that point, had become very organized. It took them a while to get all organized and align with each other and say, look, our priority, whether it was, the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Disabled American Veterans, I could list all the number of veterans organizations. They all said toxic exposure was our major priority. And Jon Stewart, the comedian, had taken up the cause of the first responders and then the 9/11 attacks. It was very successful at drawing attention to that, and then it was kind of a natural sort of eliding into this other issue of service members being exposed to toxic substances. So Jon Stewart became, a kind of big media voice. So it was a combination of veteran service organizations, veterans themselves presenting with these sort of conditions, medical conditions after. But it took time for all of this to kind of get organized, and I would say also political leadership. I had several members of Congress that my colleagues that introduced different parts of the PACT Act. The PACT Act is really an amalgam of the different, my colleague to the east of us, Dr. Ruiz, became a very impassioned advocate for introducing more presumptive illnesses, like illnesses that are presumed to have been caused by being exposed to burn pits. He had a constituent that died of cancer. And he was also on the committee and had authored legislation. So when I became chairman of the committee, I said, okay, Raul, I'm going to take your legislation. I'm going to take legislation by Congressman Luria, different members of the House. We kind of knitted together legislation. I also told the veteran service organizations that, I also wanted to go beyond the veterans that suffered exposure at burn pits. I also wanted to include smaller groups of veterans whose political voice was much less. They had been suffering for years. People that were exposed to, say, radiation because of certain accidents that might have happened or cleanup that they were involved in. They weren't, given the right equipment. There were radiation exposed veterans. There were veterans that were still exposed to Agent Orange in areas that we hadn't acknowledged before. So I said, let's try to include as many veterans that were exposed as possible. So that took some time. I introduced the legislation into the House of Representatives in 2022. So it took me from like 2019 to help build the support within Congress to work with. Actually, we kind of were in communication with Jon Stewart, and we built the support within the House, and we passed the legislation. And we actually, so Jon Stewart went to President Biden and asked President Biden to put it into his State of the Union speech in 2022, and President Biden agreed. And he it was like only less than 2 minutes. He says, I want to ask Congress, I'm asking Congress to present to me on my desk comprehensive legislation on toxic exposure. And then we had done the homework from 2019 to 2022. And Speaker Pelosi said, I'm going to schedule time for you, Mark Takano, to go to the floor the day after the speech, and you're going to introduce the bill. We were ready. I mean, it's like, so it takes time to put all this together, to do the negotiating. We were negotiating with our Senate partners who were also from the same party, because we have to understand what can pass the Senate. So I passed the bill with all Democratic votes and 34 Republicans, and it went to the Senate. It did not get filibustered. Well, it was filibustered for a little bit. That's a whole longer story. But it took, sometimes it takes a while for us to build the support because it was going to cost us a lot of money. And I got to say, my Republican colleagues were not really thrilled with the kind of money that it was going to cost. And we had to find the will to pay for this. But we call this the cost of war PACT Act. It's the total cost of war. I mean, the idea is that sometimes the effects of war don't show up immediately. It's not like, a grenade goes off, or an IED on the road goes off, and suddenly you have to deal with injuries that result from the heat of combat. Sometimes the environmental and occupational hazards that you're exposed to don't present complications until years later, right? And so by that time, the drama of the moment of military service, the drama of combat, has gone away. But where's the public commitment to take care of somebody who has nevertheless still experiencing the effects of warfare and combat, right? And so that's what we're dealing with in the political system.
Yeah, focusing on the intangible effects that a veteran might have is very meaningful.
or something that's not detected right away.
Yeah.
And then the intangible things that's another whole topic of that's not necessarily a toxic exposure, but that's sort of like there's a greater recognition of PTSD today. It was called a different name after World War I and World War II. Or traumatic brain injury. That's another one, right? Those are kind of those are more occupational kind of exposures. So there's more to do, by the way. I thought we were pretty good at getting, like, this was a huge bill. You're right, it's the biggest bill of my career. But I'm now understanding that there's still more to do. For example, we're finding out that Air Force pilots, we actually commissioned a study on this. We were spending like $1 million on this study, but pilots in fighter jets were discovering they were getting sort of testicular cancer, and it might have been because of the exposure to radar that was between. They was coming from in this tight cockpit coming from sitting straddling kind of the radar unit. We're not really sure, but so that's going on. There's the Nevada test site. There's a whole group of, now this is a different situation. There's a whole bunch of airmen and airwomen that were stationed there and that were exposed to radiation from the test site. Now we know that Department of Energy employees who are civilian, their exposure has been recognized. They've been compensated, but the Air Force doesn't want to acknowledge that these airmen were exposed to anything. So it's a bureaucratic snafu, which there are people who are on. There's a way for us to deal with the fact that service members were on a classified sort of mission. But here's this strange thing where the VA and the Department of Defense, they're not really communicating, and as a result, we've got a lot of people that are suffering.
Well, thank you so much. I think unfortunately that's all the time we have for today. I would love to have like more time, but
I know I took a long time to answer these questions. I wasn't trying to. Yeah,
that was great. I think it's a great way to wrap up our podcast today. Thank you so much for joining Policy Chats. And,
great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Policy Chats, the official podcast of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on Instagram at UCR_SPP. To learn more about our program and upcoming episodes, visit spp.ucr.edu. For the video version of this episode, check out our YouTube channel at UCR School of Public Policy. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.